Hi, I'm Marty, and in the past few weeks, in 2021, during the pandemic, I studied for and passed the National Counselor's Exam. In the next minutes, I want to share some information with you about how I was successful in passing the exam and how you can be successful too. But first of all, let me give you some reasons why you should listen to me. First, here's evidence of my passing score. So you can see on this and under my name right there, it indicates a passing score. You can see that I had my mask on when I took the picture and of course the NBCC information. So I did in fact pass the test. I'm providing this video resource for you because there were some resources I couldn't find in my ability to study for the test that I want you to have to be accessible for you. Why should you listen to me? One, I just passed the exam recently. I'm passing on my tips to you. Two, I've been a university professor for more than 20 years. And as a university professor, I know something about tests in general and how to pass. By the way, I should also mention that when I passed with a reasonable amount of success. I could have missed 37 more questions and still pass the exam. So I passed with a reasonable, large margin of success for the questions that needed to be passed. I've been a university professor, so I know something about taking tests and studying, but probably most importantly, why I would encourage you to listen to me as a resource for the study of your National Counselor's Exam is because I earned my degree in counseling over a decade ago. And while I taught in the area of humanities, I have not been working in the practice of psychology or counseling for more than a decade, except in kind of an ancillary role. So when in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, I decided I would leave my university job and begin to pursue a career that would take me as a licensed professional counselor, I needed to start all over again. And if I can, in less than a period of 6 months, go back to a degree that I earned more than a decade ago and refresh all of that understanding to pass my exam, I believe the study techniques that I used that were helpful to me can be helpful to you too. Let me give you some tips and tricks on preparing for the exam. You should know much of this information if you're preparing for the National Counselor's Exam, but the National Counselor's Exam is a 4-hour exam. 4 hours long. It is a long exam. It takes a lot of mental energy and stamina to get through it. You need to start planning and studying not just weeks, but months in advance. That is my first tip for you. As a test that is a 4-hour test that is stressful, you should know that the test itself is stressful, but you should also know that going to a testing center like I did, a Pearson VUE Center located at a university in the United States of America, was also its own kind of disorienting environment because I had to scan my hand in when I left to take a break, and when I came back, I was masked. There was social distancing going on. So there was a lot going on just about the sort of techniques of the exam itself. And then, of course, as a 4-hour exam, it is simply exhausting with 8 content areas and all that's going on with it. And I want to offer you some strategies for the test itself, for preparing for the test, and of course, issues for study. So with that in mind, let's move forward. This might seem kind of odd, but the first thing I would encourage you to do as you prepare to study for the exam is create a playlist. Yeah, that's what I said. Some sort of musical playlist. Songs that get you in the mood, songs that get you pumped up, and songs that excite you. It will help you in all of your study. And during the exam, when you feel exhausted, and you will feel exhausted because it is a 4-hour long exam, you'll want something to go back to. So while I was preparing and studying for the exam, I had a playlist that I listened to, and it played in my head mentally while I was taking the test. Helped keep me in the mood for the test. I also, ironically, pulled up some funny images, some images from the internet and some videos that I watched that made me laugh. And I used those in my periods of study, and I used them during my exam. That's exactly right. In a very disciplined way, when I took my exam, because it was exhausting, because the environment was different for me, because it took a lot of energy, I intentionally took 2 breaks where I did nothing more than stepped out of the room and reminded myself of my playlist and reminded myself of some of those funny images in order to reset my mind and recalibrate what I was doing. And that might seem a little silly. I tell you that I passed the exam, and I tell you that the first thing you should do is create a playlist and have some funny images or videos to remember. But let me tell you, it's a 4-hour long exam, and it was stressful. So having those things for your practice and study along the way will help you, and it will help you on the exam itself. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about some more urgent issues, the content that you have to know in order to pass the National Counselor's Exam. What I want to share with you now is I want to share with you my experience during the exam itself. So you should know, of course, you'll be taking your test at a Pearson VUE testing center, or likely so. There are normal check-in procedures, ID issues, bring your passports and your multiple forms of ID that you have to be oriented to. But during the pandemic, it becomes even more than that. There's hand washing and putting on sanitizer between things. When you leave and enter the room, probably under normal conditions, you have to put your palm on a scanning device in order to make sure it's you coming and going. You have to pull your mask down in order to be seen, in order for them to take a picture of you. It's a pretty stressful environment. In addition, you're in a closed room at a testing center. Now that can be relatively comfortable, but again, with social distancing and different things, it's a stress-filled environment. And I want you to be a success on that day. So I want you to know that for me, even though I was prepared for that stress-filled environment and knew that there'd be scanning and masking issues, and just knowing that it took place and me sharing with you that it's part of the process, I hope, can calm some of your anxieties and fears, because it's a 4-hour-long exam that takes a lot of energy. Now, with that in mind, let me tell you what I did when I took my test. I got oriented into the place. I took the 15-20 minutes to get checked in. I went through the instructions on the video screen that told me how I would take the test. I put in their provided earplugs into my ears, and I also put over-the-ear earmuffs on. In fact, when I was studying for the exam, I regularly studied with earplugs in and earmuffs on. I was thankful they were there at the Pearson VUE Center. It allowed me to be focused on the screen and on the questions that I was focused on. I also had a strategy for taking the test itself, and that is answering the questions, and I would encourage you to have a strategy. I was provided with, and I assume you will be provided with, 2 dry erase type pages, which I could take notes on. Now let me share a few things about that note page as I tell you about how it was provided to me and what was told to me. First, I was told that I could not do what's called a brain dump. Now, I didn't know the terminology of the brain dump, but I knew exactly what it was, and that is sitting down and writing down all of the charts that you have memorized as soon as you start the test. Thankfully, I actually contacted the Pearson VUE Center a month before I took my test, and I inquired about that exact thing, so I knew I couldn't do it. But that was important and strategic for me because when I was studying for my test, I did things like memorize the standard deviation chart. That's my own replication of it from a standard test. And then if you know your Piaget, Freud, Erikson, Kohlberg charts, something that looks like this, I had planned to have that memorized and I was just gonna write it out when I started the test. Nope, you can't do that. So know that you have a set of dry erase pages beside you. And when you get to questions on the test that ask you these kinds of questions and you remember it, you can write it down. But don't plan to do a brain dump. You can't have these in your short-term memory and just replicate them when you get started. Although about halfway through the test, I did have a question about standard deviations. So I replicated a chart that looked like that with my Stay9 charts and my Z-scores and my T-scores, and I was able to use that as a resource when I took the test. When you take the test, there will be 200 questions. Here's what I did and what I would encourage something as a procedure for you as you take your test. I used the first 2 hours of the test to answer all 200 questions. Now, I'd been studying in the weeks before using practice tests available on the internet, so I knew about how long it takes me to read questions and move through questions. And I took the first 2 hours and answered every single question on the test, all 200 questions. So you should think to yourself, well, that 4-hour test only took you 2 hours. Nope, I was far from done. You see, when I took the test, of the questions that I answered, 150 of them I flagged for review. So what that means is, that means that only 50 of the 200 questions that I answered did I answer in a way where I thought with confidence, I don't need to look at this question again, I don't need to review this question again, I know that I have it. So I want to share with you, you should come up with some strategy on your own for being prepared to flag questions and come back and review them. Now again, let me note for you, I flagged 150 of the 200 questions. That's a lot. 50 of them I knew I had, I didn't want to look at again. The 150 though, I needed to come back and study. So here's what I did after 2 hours. I got up and took a break. I got up, walked out of the room. I had to flag down the person who would let me get out of the room. I walked out of the room. I went into the hallway. I remembered my playlist. I remembered some of the things that made me laugh, and I relaxed. And I did a little short mindful breathing exercise to sort of refresh myself, but I actually laughed and reminded myself if I had to press send on that test right now, I answered all 200 questions and I could be done. And then I thought to myself, now I'm going to use the next 2 hours to strategically make sure I know those 150 that I passed. I went back in the room and I more rapidly was able to go through those 150 questions because I'd already answered the questions after all, but I wanted to review them. When I went through the process of reviewing them, I flagged 31 questions from the 150. I flagged 31 that I still needed to come back and answer. So of course, if you do the math, that means I answered 50 at the beginning and I answered another 119, and then I had 31 left to answer. I now had about an hour left on the exam, and you know what I did? I took another break. I walked out of the room, I walked out into the hall, I remembered my playlist, I remembered the videos that made me laugh and made me think about things that were funny, and I refreshed myself thinking, I am down to the last 31 questions, the most difficult questions for me that I need to reorient to. I want to be fresh. So I took the 4-hour exam and I broke it into a 2-hour exam to take the whole test, another hour to review the 150 questions, and now I had my last hour to review the 31 questions that I found to be difficult or challenging in some particular way. When I came back to the exam, I had an hour left for 31 questions. Now let me first of all tell you about one question. I spent approximately 10 minutes on one question. I won't go into the details here, but if you take the NCE exam, you should know that I think it's 40 or 60 questions on the test, or sample test questions that they're testing for future iterations of the test. I'm convinced one of them was wrong. I spent 10 minutes looking at a question. It had math involved. I'm pretty good at math, and I am convinced that none of the answers was a good answer. Now, you should know that on the test, you always have to pick the best answer, and sometimes there are good answers and there's the best answer. This one had math involved. I'm positive there wasn't a correct answer. But nevertheless, that was the one question that's the rule out. That leaves 30 questions left. Of those 30 questions left, I want to tell you that there were 18 questions for which I changed the answer. Now, you should know when you take a test that it's general rule that you shouldn't change your answer. You should go with the first answer that you answered. As a statistical probability, you'll more likely get your answer correct if you go with your gut as you first answered. But as I went back through those 31 questions, there was one that I said is not a correct answer to it. I struggled and went over that one for a long time. But then 18 questions I changed the answer to. Now, I looked at those questions for a lot of minutes, and I really processed, am I sure I want to change this answer? Do I really want to do it? On 18 questions, I changed the answer. There were then another 12 questions that were very difficult. Whatever it was that they were asking, and I couldn't remember all of the detail, but I would tell you that there were 12 questions where I was struggling with either knowing a conceptual issue, recognizing a name, understanding the nuance of choosing between one question and another that might have had a better answer. Of course, I elected to choose the answers that I chose, and in choosing the answers that I chose, I made the best in those 12 questions, really best guesses. I narrowed it down to probably a question, an answer or two. But of course, with that test-taking strategy, with having a soundtrack in my mind, something to laugh at, getting up, being prepared for the 4-hour exam and structuring it in my own way to break it down into sort of stressful chunks, I was a success. And so I'll remind you again, here's my picture. Here's my NBCC score and my passing success. And again, using that method, I passed the test and I could have missed another 37 questions and still passed. So what worked for me, I hope will work for you. Let me share a few other resources for you as I move through this video, and want to give you some other things about how I studied and how, even though I hadn't been in the field of psychology and counseling in a practiced and disciplined way for the last 10 years, I was able to study and pass my test. So you know, the NCE is an aptitude test. You'll learn things about achievement tests and aptitude tests and percentiles and percentages and all kinds of variants as you study for the exam. There are numerous things that you can and should do in order to get prepared. Of course, in this video, I'm just going to share with you resources that I used. Let me first of all tell you that I started studying for my test 6 months before I took it. You should know as well that you need to get permission from your state licensing agency to have permission to take the test, and you need to schedule the test. And during the pandemic and with social distancing, finding a time at a testing center to take the test is more difficult than you might think. So let me encourage you, don't wait until the month before to trying to find a test time. Look 3 and 4 months in advance and get a test time mapped out for yourself. Now, in my particular process, what I did for my study of my test, I got resources that helped me with study. So 6 months out, I purchased the Encyclopedia of Counseling, famously known as the Authentic Purple Book by Howard Rosenthal. And in my first 2 months of study, this was the only resource I used. It has questions in each of the subject areas, and then it has answers, and then it has descriptions of the answers. And in the first 2 months of my study, I would estimate that I used this book between 5 to 10 hours a week, and I randomly would just open it up to a page and I would answer questions. And then I'd randomly flip to another page. So I was distributing my study time across the various content areas. And you'll see that I had a method by which I would track questions. So my own method was I put a plus mark in the column if I got the answer correct by just my intuitive knowledge or whatever I'd studied. And I put a negative in the column if I got it wrong. So you'll see on this page right here, I have a number of pluses, and then I have a D or a G. A D for me means I deduced the correct answer. A G means I guessed, which means at that point in time in my study, whenever I was taking it, I didn't know what I was looking at. I simply guessed for a question. And as I worked through the test, you'll see that at a number of places, I also got negatives. Now, I can't find a negative here. So here's a negative that I gave myself. That means when I took that question, I got it wrong. On this opposite page over here, I have 2 negatives. That means 2 questions back to back that I got wrong. So when I worked through the textbook, I worked through it in a way where I used it as a study resource. And by flagging questions with a negative or a plus in my method, I was able to flag the questions that I had a good sense of and the questions that I didn't have a good sense of. Now that was important to me because then when I went back through the full text after I'd worked my way through it 5 and 10 hours a week over the first couple of months, I was able to recognize there were some theoretical issues, there were some theorists, and there were some areas of content that I was definitely weaker on. I didn't know those issues, and there were others that I was stronger on. Of course, in studying for a test, you want to focus your study time on where you are weak, not where you are strong. Where you're strong, you're going to get answers correct on the test. So it was able to help me focus. Now, technically, the next 2 months of study for me in the preparation for the National Counselor exam was really not too practical. And the reason is there was a coronavirus going on. I was making an interstate move. I had some other things going on professionally for me. So honestly, in the middle 2 months, my study was a little bit random and haphazard. But I continued to use the purple textbook. In addition, I got a hold of Howard Rosenthal's discs. Now, these discs were very helpful to me, also by Howard Rosenthal. A couple of problems with the discs. One, they're discs, they're CD discs. So if you want to use them as a resource for study, then you may need to find a CD player. Or you might want to do what I did. That is, after purchasing the device, I had someone that I know use technology to transfer that information onto this iPod device that I used for listening to the paid subscription that I made to the CDs. Now, I want to share with you that I listened to these CDs, I can't even tell you how many, probably hundreds of hours in a casual way. And that includes the fact that I listened to them almost every night when I was going to sleep for a period of about 60 and 75 days. So I used the discs in a passive way for studying. They weren't the direct means for me to learn all of the information, but nevertheless, it reinforced information consistently. And Howard Rosenthal also does a great job of telling you, as a person who's studying for tests, that you need to use mnemonic devices, that is, memory tools, for your study practices. I borrowed a number of Dr. Rosenthal's mnemonic devices, and I created a number for myself. So, for example, REBT theory, I just remembered that the E stands for Ellis. Albert Ellis is the founder of that. Salvador Minuchin, I tied to a cathedral I visited in Barcelona because it's the Mia Familia Salvador Cathedral. And I remember then that Salvador Minuchin, the Salvador and the Mia Familia Salvador Cathedral is about this structure where a family comes to worship. And guess what? Salvador Minuchin is structural family therapy. So you need to come up with your own mnemonic devices for studying. In the last 2 months of my study, I added a few other resources. I used the NCE secrets text, and I found that this really is just a condensed version of the larger material that's found in this textbook. But both of them were helpful to me. The purple textbook was more helpful to me. I also purchased flashcards from the MoMatrix system. Now, I'll be honest with you, I didn't love these flashcards from the MoMatrix system. I didn't love them as a study resource, but one of the things that they did for me is in the last days, literally the last 2 weeks as I prepared for the test, what I was able to do is I was able to take all of these resources, they're rubber banded by the different subject content areas, and I was able to flip through all of them, and I separated out the ones where I remained weak in my study. So from these large stacks, I've already put them back together now in an organized way, but I had probably, a stack maybe about that thick. And it was cards from the whole stack that were ones that I was weak on, that I needed to reinforce. So in the week and two before I took the exam, I reinforced and studied for those areas. Now, another thing I want to point out for you is that when I used the audio resource, I did something else. While I used and listened to the audio resource, I typed a transcript of nearly every important thing. This is, let's see, what is this here? This is 62 plus pages, 64 pages of my own transcription of the content of these audio resources. So I not only listened to them in a passive way, I also transformed them into a transcript that I could use. So notice I use lots of different resources to study over the period of the 6 months that I studied, and particularly now in the last 2 months. So the transcript that I created was in the last 2 months. In addition to that, in the last couple of times when I was listening to it, I did a hand transcription where I was just focusing on the last things that I couldn't remember or the details that I couldn't focus on. And then in the couple of days before the exam was over, I went back to charts like this one with Piaget, Kohlberg, Erickson, and Freud's and their stages of development, of course, psychosexual and psychosocial, cognitive and moral stages. And I basically, in the last days, I committed this to memory, and I committed the standard deviation chart with all of its information to memory. So from my study, I'll share with you again, I studied for 2 months, pretty casual, not too worried about it, but working diligently 5 to 10 hours per week through this textbook. The middle 2 months, I didn't get too much study done. Again, pandemic, I was moving, different things going on professionally for me. But the last 2 months, I studied 3 to 4 hours every single day and Saturday and Sunday, working through each of these materials, diligently listening, audio practice, reviewing content. Now, that might seem like a lot of hours, but let me share a few things with you that were important to me. One, I knew when I passed the test, I'd be done. I wasn't going back to it again. I knew when I passed the test, I wouldn't have to pay for the test again. So I was willing to spend some extra, quite frankly, hundreds of dollars in order to make sure that I was ready and prepared for the test. And I didn't want to pay the testing program again. Let me also tell you one other resource that I used. The one other resource that I used is actually two resources, but it's one resource in that it's an online resource. I used the website tests.com, and following the backslashes, it goes to the National Counselor exam. I paid a subscription fee for that access point in the last 2 weeks of my study. I also paid for a subscription to the NCE exam at the nationalcounselingexam.com. Again, nationalcounselingexam.com. Now, I only used those two resources in the last 2 weeks of my study, and essentially, I stopped going through my textbook. I stopped using this textbook. I stopped using the flashcards, except that small stack that I had left, and I spent the last 2 weeks practicing taking the test, or questions similar to the test. Now that means, for example, at the nationalcounselingexam.com website, I didn't use probably 90% of the resources that were on that website, but I didn't want the other resources. Maybe you do. I wanted to practice taking the test. So I would take 4-hour-long tests and 30-minute-long tests, and I tried to take tests quickly so that I could move through questions and feel a sort of comfort with it. I could also feel, by taking practice tests quickly, I could sense that there were certain areas where I was weak on. So for example, if I was missing questions consistently on, say, Jean Piaget, I would know, I better get some focus on him. I need to pull some resources out, and then I would do that. Then the day of the exam, I was down to my last few resources. When I went into the exam, I had a couple of cheat sheets with me like this. This one just tells me, slow down. So when I took the test, I didn't go too quickly and miss something. This one told me to stand up, and that was a reminder to get up and take my breaks and make sure and use them to my advantage. I literally wrote as a list to myself, laugh, so that I knew that I would be able to sort of rejuvenate my energy and re-collaborate my breathing during the 4-hour-long test. I also wrote, don't rush, read every answer. In the last 2 weeks, when I was taking the practice test, I missed a ton of questions. Now, the reason I was missing the questions on the practice test, I was intentionally taking the test questions quickly. And what I would do is I would find a correct answer and I would choose it, and then I'd click answer and I got it wrong. And I'd go back and look at it and I realized I wasn't reading slowly enough and I didn't read all of the answers. So by taking 2 weeks to take several practice exams at the nationalcounselingexam.com website and the test.com website, by using those resources to take practice exams, I felt pretty good going into the exam on that morning. Now, it was still stressful. I still wanted to get a good night's sleep the nights before the test. I wanted to eat food that wouldn't make me sick at my stomach. I wanted to know that I knew what the drive time was to the testing center and make sure I'd be there safely and securely. I even had a backup ride ready. And I wanted to know that I'd feel comfortable during that test. But in these ways, I passed the National Counselor's Exam. And so if I want to review everything that I shared with you in this video, I'll share these things. Plan in advance. Plan by studying 6 months in advance, and study from several different resources: audio resources, online resources, flashcards, and textbooks. Don't think you can study at the last minute for the test. Now, you may be able to. I'd been away from the clinical practice of counseling for more than a decade, so I needed to study. But by studying over a period of 6 months and studying in a focused way, I was ready to take the test. And when I took the test, I'm proud to say, I passed. You can too. I hope this resource has been helpful to you in understanding what the National Counselor's Exam was like for me, how I studied, and how I took the test on the day during the pandemic at a Pearson VUE Center to be a success for my National Counselor's Exam, and I hope you will be a success too.